At its peak, one empire governed a quarter of all human beings on Earth, and it began on a rain-soaked island smaller than most of its future colonies. A single chartered company ruled more people than most European nations combined. A single navy controlled every ocean, and a single parliament in London drew borders that still bleed today. This is the complete story of the British Empire, from its deepest roots to its final unraveling. We trace every step, from Roman legions on the shores of Kent and Anglo-Saxon kings forging the idea of England, through Tudor privateers and Stuart plantations, through the slave trade and the conquest of India, through the factories of Manchester that armed an empire and the trenches of the Somme that drained it. We walk through the lives of monarchs and merchants, soldiers and the enslaved, administrators in tropical hill stations, and indentured labourers on sugar estates half a world from home. We witness the zenith, when red covered the map from Cairo to Calcutta to the Caribbean, and we witness the collapse, when colony after colony tore itself free, sometimes in negotiation, sometimes in blood. The borders drawn by this empire still define nations. The language it spread still dominates global commerce. The wounds it inflicted still shape conflicts from Kashmir to Palestine to Northern Ireland. This is not distant history. It is the architecture of the present world. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, kingdoms, and empires, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week we bring you the full story of a world that shaped history. The story starts long before the empire. It starts with the land itself. Rain falls on grey stone. It has fallen here for millennia, pooling in the crevices of chalk cliffs that face the narrow channel separating this archipelago from the continent. The land is old, older than any name given to it. Granite highlands in the north and west, where ancient rock pushes through thin soil. Rolling lowlands in the south and east, where rivers carve wide valleys toward the sea. Everywhere, the sea. No point on these islands lies more than 70 miles from salt water. This single geographic fact, insularity, will shape everything that follows. Before the first Roman galley cut through the Channel fog in 55 before the Common Era, the islands had already known thousands of years of human habitation. Neolithic farmers raised Stonehenge's great sarsens around 2,500 years before Christ. Bronze Age peoples traded tin from Cornwall across routes stretching to the Mediterranean. By the Iron Age, Celtic-speaking tribes dominated. The Brigantes in the north, the Iceni in the east, the Silures in Wales. They built hill forts, worked iron ploughs into heavy clay soils, and traded with Gaul. Their druids kept oral traditions in sacred groves. Their warriors painted themselves with woad. They had no written law, no centralized state, no unified identity. They were dozens of peoples sharing a family of languages and a landscape bounded by water. When Julius Caesar landed on the shingle beaches of Kent, he found a society sophisticated in metalwork and agriculture, but fragmented in politics. His two expeditions, 55 and 54 before the Common Era, were reconnaissance, not conquest. Nearly a century passed before Emperor Claudius sent 4 legions in 43 of the Common Era to claim the islands for Rome. Within decades, Roman roads stitched the lowlands together. Watling Street, Ermine Street, the Fosse Way, straight lines of engineered stone cutting through forest and marsh. Towns rose at river crossings, Londinium at the Thames, Eboracum at the Ouse, Aquae Sulis at the hot springs of Bath, A wall of stone and turf stretched from the Solway Firth to the River Tyne, Hadrian's Wall, built from 122 of the Common Era, marking the empire's northern frontier against the Caledonian tribes Rome could not subdue. For nearly 4 centuries, Britannia existed as a Roman province. Latin became the language of administration and commerce. Villas with hypocaust heating and mosaic floors dotted the southern countryside. Christianity arrived, slowly displacing older beliefs. But Rome's grip was always tenuous at the margins. The province required a permanent garrison of tens of thousands. When the legions withdrew, formerly around 410, recalled to defend a crumbling continental empire, they left behind roads, walls, towns, and a Christian faith, but no successor state. The administrative machinery collapsed within a generation. Into this vacuum came new peoples from across the North Sea. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, Germanic-speaking warriors and farmers, crossed in boats of clinker-built oak during the 5th and 6th centuries. Whether by invasion, migration, or gradual settlement remains debated, but the result transformed the islands. Celtic-speaking Britons were pushed westward into Wales, Cornwall, and across the sea to Brittany. The newcomers established small kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, each ruled by warrior lords dispensing justice from timber halls. They brought their own gods, their own tongue, Old English, and their own social structures: thanes, curals, and thralls bound by oaths of loyalty. The very name England derives from the Angles. The land was being remade, not merely occupied. New identities crystallized around kinship, lordship, and territory. The island's deep plurality, Celtic, Roman, Germanic, became the bedrock upon which later centuries would build. A new dynasty seizes the throne on a blood-soaked field in Leicestershire. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeats Richard III at Bosworth and claims the crown by right of conquest. The man who becomes Henry VII is no warrior king in the old mold. He is a calculator, a hoarder of coin, a builder of ledgers. His England is exhausted by 30 years of civil war, its treasury depleted, its nobility thinned. But the island's geography has not changed. The sea still surrounds it, and the sea is beginning to whisper of possibilities beyond anything the medieval world imagined. In 1492, Columbus crosses the Atlantic under the Spanish flag. 5 years later, Henry VII sends his own venture westward. A Venetian mariner named Giovanni Caboto, known in English as John Cabot, sails from Bristol with a crew of 18 men aboard the small ship Matthew. In June of 1497, Cabot makes landfall somewhere along the coast of Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. He plants the banners of England and Venice, claims the territory for the English crown, and returns with news of waters so thick with cod that baskets lowered over the side come up full. It is not gold, not spices, but it is wealth, and it is a beginning. Henry rewards Cabot with £10 and an annual pension. The investment is modest. The precedent is not. Henry VII understands that England's future depends on trade, not territorial conquest in France. He negotiates commercial treaties with Burgundy and the Hanseatic League. He builds the first purpose-designed royal warships, among them the Regent and the Sovereign, not merely converted merchantmen, but vessels constructed for naval warfare, their hulls reinforced, their guns mounted in rows. At the Royal Dockyard in Portsmouth, the infrastructure of sea power takes its earliest institutional form. The king dies in 1509, having doubled the crown's revenues and left a full treasury to his son. Henry VIII inherits wealth, ambition, and a navy. Over his reign, he expands the fleet from 5 ships to around 50, establishes the Navy Board to administer it, and builds new dockyards at Deptford and Woolwich along the Thames. The Mary Rose, launched in 1511, carries heavy bronze cannon on a dedicated gun deck, a technological leap that transforms naval combat from boarding actions into artillery duels. But it is Henry's break with Rome that reshapes England's destiny most profoundly. When Pope Clement VII refuses to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry declares himself supreme head of the Church of England in 1534. The Act of Supremacy severs England from Catholic Christendom. The consequences cascade. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry dissolves the monasteries. Over 800 religious houses surrendered, their lands seized, their treasures melted down. The dissolution transfers roughly a quarter of England's cultivated land to the Crown, which sells much of it to gentry and merchants. A new class of landowners emerges, their fortunes tied to the Protestant settlement, their loyalty purchased by property. The wealth that once flowed to Rome now circulates within England. Monastic lead is stripped from roofs and cast into shot. Church bells become canon. The material infrastructure of medieval Catholicism is literally reforged into the instruments of a Protestant maritime state. England is now isolated, excommunicated, surrounded by Catholic powers. Spain and France are potential enemies. The sea, once a highway for trade, becomes a defensive moat that must be held. Naval strength is no longer a luxury, it is survival. Under Henry's children, the brief reign of Edward VI, the Catholic restoration under Mary, the kingdom lurches between confessions. But the institutional foundations hold. The navy endures. The new landowners endure. Parliament endures. And when Elizabeth ascends the throne in 1558, she inherits a Protestant island state whose merchant class is growing wealthy, whose sailors are growing bold, and whose position on the Atlantic edge of Europe places it at the threshold of an oceanic age just beginning to unfold. The old queen dies at Richmond Palace in March of 1603, and the Tudor line ends with her. Within hours, riders gallop north carrying word to James Stuart, King of Scotland, that the English throne is his. 2 kingdoms, long rivals, now share a single monarch, though their parliaments, their churches, and their laws remain distinct. James VI of Scotland becomes James I of England, and he inherits something Elizabeth bequeathed but never fully exploited. A merchant class hungry for Atlantic ventures, a navy tested in war, and a charter already granted to the East India Company 3 years prior. The new century will not be content with privateering and trading posts. It demands permanent settlement. The Virginia Company receives its royal charter in 1606. The following spring, 3 small ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, carry 104 colonists into the Chesapeake Bay. They build a triangular palisade of rough-hewn timber on a marshy peninsula and name it Jamestown. The site is poorly chosen. The water is brackish, the mosquitoes carry disease, and the Powhatan Confederacy watches these intruders with growing hostility. Within months, more than half the settlers are dead. Resupply ships and fresh bodies keep the colony alive through its first desperate years. But Jamestown survives not through gold. The hoped-for treasure never materializes, but through tobacco. By 1614, John Rolfe's cultivation of a Caribbean tobacco strain produces a crop England will buy in enormous quantities. The weed reshapes everything. It demands land, labor, and more land still. Indentured servants arrive from England's poorest parishes. Then, in 1619, a Dutch warship sells approximately 20 enslaved Africans to the colonists. The transaction is small, almost incidental in the records. Its consequences will prove boundless. Farther north, a different impulse drives settlement. In 1620, the Mayflower deposits 102 Puritan separatists on the coast of what they call New England. Plymouth Colony clings to survival through its first winter, losing nearly half its number. But unlike Virginia's profit-seekers, these colonists come to build a godly commonwealth beyond the reach of bishops. The Massachusetts Bay Company, chartered in 1629, brings thousands more, educated, organized, carrying their charter with them so that governance resides in the colony itself rather than in London. By 1640, some 20,000 English men and women have crossed the Atlantic to New England. Towns with meeting houses, schools, and fenced commons dot the coastline. Meanwhile, the Caribbean beckons with a different promise. English settlers claim Barbados in 1627. Initially, they plant tobacco and cotton with indentured white labor. But within 2 decades, Dutch merchants introduce sugar cultivation techniques learned from Brazil. Sugar transforms Barbados into a furnace of profit and cruelty. By the 1650s, the island's planters are importing thousands of enslaved Africans annually. The plantation model, monoculture, enslaved labor, absentee wealth flowing back to England, crystallizes here before spreading to Jamaica, the Leeward Islands, and eventually the American South. The Atlantic slave trade, still modest in these early decades, is building the infrastructure of ships, coastal forts, and commercial networks that will eventually transport millions in chains. Back in England, the Stuart monarchy lurches toward catastrophe. Charles I governs without Parliament for 11 years, levies taxes by royal prerogative, and alienates Puritans, merchants, and the gentry alike. Civil war erupts in 1642. By 1649, the king is tried, convicted, and beheaded outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, an act that shocks Europe. The Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell proves no less imperial in ambition. The Navigation Act of 1651 decrees that colonial goods must travel in English ships to English ports, strangling Dutch competition. In 1655, Cromwell's Western design seizes Jamaica from Spain, planting England's flag over the largest Caribbean island yet claimed. Ireland is conquered with devastating thoroughness, land confiscated, Catholics dispossessed, settlers planted on stolen ground. The patterns rehearsed in Ireland now operate on both sides of the Atlantic. By 1660, when the monarchy is restored under Charles II, England possesses a chain of colonies stretching from Massachusetts to Barbados, bound by navigation laws, sustained by coerced labor, and generating wealth that flows relentlessly toward London. Charles II returns to London in May of 1660, riding through streets hung with tapestries and strewn with flowers. The monarchy is restored, but the world it governs has changed. The merchant class that financed civil war now demands returns on its investment. Within months, the new king grants charters that will reshape continents. The Royal African Company receives its monopoly in 1660, reorganized and strengthened in 1672 under the Duke of York's patronage. Its forts rise along the Gold Coast, Cape Coast Castle, its whitewashed walls facing the Atlantic surf, its dungeons holding hundreds of captives in darkness before the ships arrive. Between 1672 and 1713, the company transports over 100,000 enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and the American colonies. Gold dust and ivory fill its London warehouses, but human cargo generates the greatest profit. The triangle trade, manufactured goods to Africa, enslaved people to the Americas, sugar and tobacco back to England, becomes the engine of Atlantic commerce. In 1670, Charles grants a charter to the Hudson's Bay Company, claiming the entire watershed draining into that northern sea, a territory larger than Western Europe, known to the company simply as Rupert's Land. Fur traders push into the Canadian interior, exchanging iron goods and blankets for beaver pelts that feed the hat trade of London and Paris. Meanwhile, the East India Company consolidates its presence on the subcontinent. Bombay arrives as part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry in 1661. Charles leases it to the company in 1668. Madras already operates under company fortification. Calcutta will follow in 1690, when Job Charnock establishes a trading post on the Hooghly River. These three presidencies form the skeleton of British India, though decades of war and diplomacy remain before territorial sovereignty follows commercial privilege. London itself transforms. The Great Fire of 1666 destroys 13,000 houses and 87 churches within the old city walls. From the ashes rises Christopher Wren's new St. Paul's Cathedral, its dome visible for miles, a statement of metropolitan confidence. The rebuilt city is a city of brick and stone, of coffee houses where merchants trade insurance and shipping intelligence, of wharves groaning under colonial imports. Then comes the revolution that makes empire financially possible. In 1688, Protestant lords invite William of Orange to invade. James II flees. The Glorious Revolution installs William and Mary under conditions dictated by Parliament. The Bill of Rights of 1689 limits royal prerogative, guarantees parliamentary consent for taxation, and establishes the rule of law over the rule of kings. This constitutional settlement creates something unprecedented, a state whose debts are guaranteed not by a monarch's word, but by parliamentary statute. Investors trust it. Capital flows. In 1694, the Bank of England is founded, a joint stock institution lending the government £1.2 million at 8% interest to finance war against France. The national debt becomes not a weakness, but a weapon. Britain can borrow more cheaply than any rival, because lenders believe Parliament will honour its obligations. This fiscal military state funds navies, armies, and colonial ventures on a scale no absolute monarchy can match. The wars against Louis XIV consume a generation. The War of the Spanish Succession, from 1701 to 1713, sees the Duke of Marlborough shatter French armies at Blenheim, Ramillies, and Oudenarde. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 reshapes the imperial map. Britain gains Gibraltar, commanding the Mediterranean's entrance, Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, securing the North Atlantic fisheries, and the Asiento, the contract to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish America, opening markets previously closed to English traders. In 1707, The Act of Union merges the Scottish and English parliaments, creating the Kingdom of Great Britain. Scottish merchants gain access to colonial markets. English strategists eliminate the threat of a Franco-Scottish alliance on their northern border. The combined state possesses the constitutional stability, the financial machinery, and the naval reach to project power across oceans. By 1714, when Queen Anne dies and the Hanoverian succession begins, Britain is no longer merely an island kingdom. It is a fiscal military empire whose chartered companies, slave forts, trading posts, and naval bases span 3 continents, a commercial organism feeding wealth back to a parliamentary state that grows stronger with every war it wins. George I arrives from Hanover in 1714, speaking barely a word of English, and the political vacuum his unfamiliarity creates hands effective governance to his ministers. Within 7 years, Robert Walpole emerges as the dominant figure in Parliament, not yet called Prime Minister, but functioning as one. For 2 decades, Walpole pursues a policy of peace abroad and commercial expansion at home, understanding that every year without a European war allows colonial trade to compound. The strategy works. Between 1714 and 1740, the tonnage of British merchant shipping nearly doubles. The engine of this growth sits in the Atlantic Triangle. Ships depart Liverpool and Bristol laden with textiles, iron goods, and firearms, sailing to the West African coast where factors in fortified trading posts, Cape Coast Castle, Anomabu, Bunsey Island, exchange these manufactures for enslaved human beings. The Middle Passage carries its cargo across the ocean in conditions of calculated horror, bodies packed into holds with less than 2 feet of vertical clearance, mortality rates averaging 15%, sometimes far higher. Those who survive are sold in Kingston, Bridgetown, or Charleston. The ships then load sugar, rum, tobacco, and cotton for the return voyage to England. By 1750, Liverpool alone dispatches over 50 slaving voyages per year. The Caribbean sugar islands generate extraordinary wealth. Barbados, Jamaica, Antigua, and the Leeward Islands produce white gold, Muscovado sugar refined in boiling houses where enslaved workers labor in temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. A single Jamaican sugar estate can yield profits surpassing those of the largest English landed estate. Planters grow rich enough to purchase seats in Parliament, forming the West India lobby that defends the slave system for generations. Jamaica's enslaved population reaches 170,000 by 1750, outnumbering white settlers by a ratio exceeding 10 to 1. Resistance is constant. The Maroons, communities of escaped Africans in Jamaica's mountainous interior, wage guerrilla war until the British negotiate treaties in 1739 and 1740, granting them autonomy in exchange for returning future runaways. On the North American mainland, the 13 colonies grow with astonishing speed. Philadelphia becomes the second-largest English-speaking city in the world. Boston's merchants trade in fish, timber, and rum. Virginia's tobacco planters expand westward. By 1750, nearly 1.5 million colonists inhabit British North America, developing local assemblies, printing presses, and a culture increasingly distinct from the mother country. Then war comes. The 7 Years' War, erupting in 1756, becomes the first truly global conflict. In India, Robert Clive exploits the fracturing of Mughal authority. At Plassey in June of 1757, his force of 3,000 defeats the Nawab of Bengal's 50,000, less through military brilliance than through conspiracy with the Nawab's own generals. Bengal's revenues, among the richest in Asia, fall into company hands. In North America, the war's decisive moment arrives on the Plains of Abraham, outside Quebec, in September of 1759. General James Wolfe's troops scale the cliffs at night, forming battle lines by dawn. Both Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm die in the engagement, but the British hold the field. New France collapses. The Treaty of Paris, signed in February of 1763, reshapes the world. France cedes Canada and all territory east of the Mississippi. Spain surrenders Florida. In India, French ambitions are reduced to a handful of trading posts. Britain emerges as the dominant power in North America, the Caribbean, and the Indian subcontinent simultaneously. The cost has been immense. The national debt nearly doubles during the war, but the returns promise to be greater still. An empire that began with coastal trading posts now commands the interior of continents, the labor of millions, and the revenues of civilizations far older than itself. The ink on the Treaty of Paris is barely dry when the crisis it was meant to resolve begins generating a new one. Britain's national debt stands at £130 million by 1763, nearly doubled by the cost of the war that delivered half a continent. Someone must pay for the garrisons now stationed from Quebec to Bengal, and Parliament's gaze falls upon the colonists whose security those garrisons ostensibly protect. The Stamp Act of 1765 imposes direct taxation on the American colonies for the first time. Every legal document, newspaper, and pamphlet must bear a revenue stamp purchased from the Crown. The reaction is immediate and furious. From Boston to Charleston, colonial assemblies denounce taxation without representation. Merchants organize boycotts. Mobs burn effigies of stamp distributors. Parliament repeals the act within a year, but simultaneously passes the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The constitutional collision is now inevitable. Through the late 1760s and early 1770s, each parliamentary assertion of authority, the Townshend Duties, the Tea Act, meets escalating colonial resistance. In April of 1775, musket fire at Lexington and Concord transforms protest into war. The Continental Congress declares independence in July of 1776, and what began as a tax dispute becomes a revolutionary struggle watched by every European power. Britain's military advantages are formidable: professional soldiers, the world's largest navy, vast financial resources. But the logistics of projecting force across 3,000 miles of ocean prove crippling. The war stretches across 8 years of indecisive campaigns, guerrilla resistance, and strategic blunders. France enters the conflict in 1778, followed by Spain and the Dutch Republic. Suddenly, Britain faces a global war, its navy stretched from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. At Yorktown in October of 1781, a combined Franco-American force traps Cornwallis and his 7,000 troops. The surrender ends meaningful British military effort in America. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 recognizes the independence of the United States. Britain retains Canada, the Caribbean Sugar Islands, and its Indian possessions. But the loss is shattering. The most prosperous, most populated portion of the empire, gone. The political establishment convulses. Lord North's government falls. The crisis forces a reckoning with how colonies are governed, how trade is regulated, how power is distributed between metropole and periphery. Yet the empire does not contract. It pivots. William Pitt the Younger, Prime Minister at 24, stabilizes finances and redirects imperial energy. The India Act of 1784 establishes a board of control that brings the East India Company under parliamentary oversight while preserving its commercial operations. Lord Cornwallis, the same general who surrendered at Yorktown, is dispatched to Bengal as Governor-General, tasked with reforming the company's corrupt administration. The permanent settlement of 1793 fixes land revenue in Bengal, creating a class of zamindars loyal to British authority. India becomes the empire's new center of gravity. Simultaneously, the loss of America creates a transportation crisis. Britain can no longer ship convicts to the colonies that once absorbed them. In May of 1787, 11 ships carrying over 700 convicts depart Portsmouth for Botany Bay. The First Fleet reaches New South Wales in January of 1788. What begins as a penal dumping ground will become a settler colony, then a continental dominion. The Pacific, once peripheral, enters the imperial imagination as a space of boundless possibility. The pivot eastward accelerates through the 1790s as revolutionary France plunges Europe into a generation of war. Britain's contest with Napoleon is fought not only on battlefields but along trade routes, in colonial possessions, at choke points of global commerce. The Royal Navy becomes the instrument of survival and supremacy alike, blockading French ports, seizing enemy colonies, protecting the merchant marine that carries imperial wealth. The wars against Napoleon end at Waterloo in June of 1815, and Britain emerges not merely victorious, but structurally transformed. 22 years of near-continuous conflict have forged an industrial base unlike anything the world has seen. The ironworks that cast cannon now cast railway rails. The textile mills that wove uniforms now weave cotton for export to every continent. The financial system that funded Wellington's armies now channels capital into mines, factories, canals, and joint stock ventures with a velocity that bewilders contemporaries. Steam is the engine of this transformation. In the coal fields of Northumberland and South Wales, pit engines pump water from ever deeper shafts. In Manchester, power looms multiply output 100-fold beyond what hand weavers could achieve. By 1830, Britain produces more than half the world's cotton cloth, nearly all of it spun and woven by machine. The raw cotton arrives from the American South, picked by enslaved hands. Abolition of the trade has not severed the economic chain, merely rerouted it through market mechanisms. Liverpool's docks receive bales by the shipload. Manchester's mills consume them. Finished textiles flow outward to India, Africa, Latin America, and China, undercutting local producers and remaking global economies. The railway accelerates everything. George Stephenson's Liverpool and Manchester Railway opens in 1830, and within 2 decades more than 6,000 miles of track lace the island. Coal moves to ports, manufactures move to markets, workers move to cities. Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, and Glasgow swell with migrants from the countryside. The human cost is staggering. Children as young as 5 crawl through mine tunnels. Factory hands work 14-hour shifts in unventilated rooms. Cholera sweeps through tenements lacking sanitation. The Factory Act of 1833 limits child labor in textile mills. Subsequent acts extend protections, though enforcement remains uneven for decades. Political power shifts to match economic reality. The Reform Act of 1832 redistributes parliamentary seats from depopulated boroughs to the new industrial cities, enfranchising the propertied middle class. The Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s demands universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and annual parliaments, demands denied in their time but fulfilled within a generation. The repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, championed by Richard Cobden and John Bright, dismantles agricultural protectionism and enshrines free trade as national doctrine. Cheap grain flows in from abroad. British manufactures flow out unimpeded by tariffs. This doctrine extends beyond commerce into geopolitics. Where formal colonies prove expensive, Britain exercises dominance through trade agreements, naval coercion, and financial leverage. In Latin America, newly independent republics borrow from London banks and purchase British manufactures. The Royal Navy ensures no European rival reimpose colonial control. In the Ottoman Empire, British diplomats secure preferential trading terms. In China, the equation is starker. When the Qing dynasty attempts to suppress the opium trade that drained silver from its economy, British warships bombard coastal cities. The First Opium War, fought between 1839 and 1842, ends with the Treaty of Nanking. 5 treaty ports opened to British merchants, an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, and the cession of Hong Kong Island in perpetuity. A sovereign empire of 300 million people is forced open at gunpoint by a nation of 27 million, powered by industrial technology and naval supremacy no pre-industrial state can match. Meanwhile, Ireland starves. The potato blight strikes in 1845, and by 1852 approximately 1 million are dead and another million have emigrated. British policy, rooted in laissez-faire orthodoxy and deep prejudice, provides relief too little and too late. Grain continues to be exported from Irish ports while peasants die in ditches. The famine halves Ireland's population within a generation and embeds a fury that will fuel nationalist movements for the next century. By 1850, Britain stands as the world's workshop, banker, and policeman. Its navy commands every ocean. Its capital finances railways on 5 continents. Its manufactures flood global markets. The Crystal Palace rises in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition of 1851, a cathedral of iron and glass celebrating industrial triumph. Inside, machines hum, textiles gleam, and delegations from 40 nations marvel at the output of a small, rain-soaked island that has remade the terms of global power through coal, iron, cotton, and the ruthless logic of the market. The transformation begins not in London, but in the mango groves outside a Bengali village called Palashi. On the 23rd of June, 1757, Robert Clive's force of 3,000, a patchwork of company soldiers, sepoys, and artillery, faces the Nawab of Bengal's army of 50,000 along the banks of the Bhagirathi River. The battle lasts hours, not days. Mir Jafar, the Nawab's own commander, holds his divisions back from the fight, his treachery purchased in advance by company agents. Siraj-ud-Dawla flees on a camel. Within weeks he is dead, and Mir Jafar sits on the throne as a puppet. The company receives the Diwani, the right to collect revenue across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa in 1765, and with that single administrative grant, a trading corporation becomes the fiscal sovereign of 30 million people. The wealth is staggering. Bengal's textile output alone rivals that of all Western Europe. muslin from Dhaka, silk from Murshidabad, saltpeter for gunpowder, indigo for dye. All now flow through company warehouses at prices the company itself dictates. The drain begins immediately. Revenue extracted from Bengali peasants funds further military campaigns, purchases tea from Canton, pays dividends to shareholders in London. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General from 1772 to 1785, consolidates administrative machinery. Courts, revenue collectors, a bureaucracy conducted in Persian and increasingly in English. His impeachment trial in Westminster Hall, lasting 7 years, exposes the violence and corruption of company rule to the British public, yet ends in acquittal. The subsidiary alliance system, perfected by Lord Wellesley after 1798, extends dominion without outright annexation. Indian rulers accept British resident advisers and company troops garrisoned at their expense. In exchange, they receive protection they never requested against threats the company itself often manufactures. Hyderabad, Mysore after Tipu Sultan's death at Seringapatam in 1799, Awadh, the Maratha Confederacy after 3 brutal wars ending in 1818, one by one, the subcontinent's powers submit or are destroyed. The permanent settlement of 1793 fixes Bengal's land revenue in perpetuity, creating a class of zamindars loyal to the company, while peasants bear the crushing weight of rents that never adjust downward. Indigo planters force riots to grow cash crops on the best land. Famines recur, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770, within a decade of company revenue control, kills an estimated 10 million. Ram Mohan Roy, writing in the 1820s, engages British liberalism on its own terms, advocating the abolition of sati and the introduction of English education. The company obliges selectively, banning sati in 1829, establishing English medium schools, reshaping Indian society according to utilitarian blueprints that serve administrative convenience as much as reform. Lord Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse, applied ruthlessly through the 1840s and 50s, annexes any princely state whose ruler dies without a natural male heir. Satara, Jhansi, Nagpur, Awadh, kingdom after kingdom absorbed. The annexation of Punjab in 1849, following the Anglo-Sikh Wars, brings the last major independent power under company control. By 1856, the map of India is nearly entirely red. Then the cartridges arrive. In early 1857, new Enfield rifle cartridges greased with animal fat, rumored to contain both cow and pig tallow, must be bitten open before loading. Hindu and Muslim sepoys refuse. Discipline collapses. On the 10th of May, sepoys at Meerut mutiny, march to Delhi, and proclaim the aged Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar their sovereign. The rebellion spread across the Gangetic Plain, Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi. For months, company authority simply ceases to exist across vast stretches of northern India. The reconquest is savage. Delhi is stormed in September. Lucknow is relieved, then retaken. Rebels are blown from cannons, villages are burned wholesale. By 1858, the rebellion is crushed, and the East India Company is abolished. The Government of India Act transfers sovereignty directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria's proclamation promises religious tolerance and respect for princely treaties. India becomes the Raj, governed from Calcutta by a viceroy answerable to Parliament, administered by the Indian civil service, defended by a reconstituted army, carefully divided along lines of caste and religion to prevent future unity. The jewel is now set firmly in the imperial crown, held not by merchants but by the state itself. The Viceroy's new capital at Calcutta stands as the administrative heart of a dominion stretching from the Khyber Pass to the Straits of Malacca. But the transformation of 1858 does more than transfer sovereignty from a trading company to the crown. It announces a new philosophy of imperial governance, one built on railways, telegraphs, codified law, and the quiet confidence that British civilization represents the pinnacle of human achievement. The decades that follow are the years of Pax Britannica, when the empire reaches its zenith of self-assurance and global reach. The infrastructure comes first. By 1870, more than 5,000 miles of railway track cross the Indian subcontinent, carrying cotton to Bombay's docks, troops to frontier garrisons, and administrative officers to district headquarters. The telegraph wire follows the rail line. Messages that once took months by sailing ship now flash from Calcutta to London in hours through undersea cables laid across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The cable network expands relentlessly. By 1880, over 97,000 miles of submarine cable connect every major British possession. Information is power, and Britain controls the wires. At home, the Second Reform Act of 1867 doubles the electorate, enfranchising urban working men for the first time. Disraeli and Gladstone alternate in power, their rivalry shaping both domestic reform and imperial ambition. It is Disraeli who executes the masterstroke of 1875, purchasing the Khedive of Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company for £4 million, financed through the Rothschild Bank. The canal, opened in 1869, halves the voyage to India. Control of its shares gives Britain leverage over Egypt's finances and, ultimately, its sovereignty. The following year, the Royal Titles Act of 1876 proclaims Victoria Empress of India. The title is more than vanity. It signals to European rivals, to Indian princes, and to the subcontinent's 300 million subjects that India belongs permanently to the British Crown. Government House in Calcutta, with its neoclassical columns and sweeping lawns, becomes the seat of a viceregal court modelled on monarchy itself. Expansion continues at the periphery. In Malaya, the Pankor Treaty of 1874 installs British residents in the tin-rich sultanates of Perak, Selangor, and Sungai Ujong. In southern Africa, the annexation of the Transvaal in 1877 provokes Boer resentment that will fester for decades. The Zulu War of 1879 begins with catastrophe at Isandlwana, over 1,300 British and colonial troops killed by Cetshwayo's impis, before overwhelming firepower prevails at Ulundi. Egypt falls next. Nationalist revolt under Colonel Urabi threatens European bondholders and canal access. In September of 1882, British forces under Wolseley defeat Urabi's army at Tel el-Kebir in under an hour. The occupation is declared temporary. It will last 72 years. The Royal Navy underpins everything. Its ironclad battleships, coal-fueled and armoured, patrol from Malta to Singapore, from the Cape to Halifax. The two-power standard, maintaining a fleet equal to the next two largest navies combined, ensures that no rival can challenge British sea lanes. In the settler colonies, self-governance advances. Canada's Confederation of 1867, followed by responsible government in the Australian colonies and New Zealand, creates a tier of loyal dominions that manage their own affairs while remaining bound to the crown in defense and foreign policy. The Indian Councils Act of 1861, by contrast, offers only advisory roles to Indian elites, a careful distinction between white settlers deemed capable of self-rule and subject peoples deemed unready. Then comes the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. 14 nations gather to regulate European claims in Africa. No African representatives attend. The conference does not itself partition the continent, but it establishes the rules by which partition will proceed: effective occupation, notification of claims, free navigation of the Congo and Niger rivers. Britain enters the scramble with advantages no rival can match: naval supremacy, capital, and existing footholds from the Cape to Cairo, from Lagos to Zanzibar. The High Victorian Empire stands at the summit of its power, its confidence unshaken, its contradictions not yet visible to those who govern from London's imperial ministries. The rules agreed upon in Berlin now translate into boots on red earth, gunboats on brown rivers, and flags raised over villages whose inhabitants have never heard of the European powers claiming sovereignty above them. Between 1885 and 1900, nearly the entire African continent passes under European control, and Britain seizes the largest share, roughly 30% of the landmass, from the mangrove coasts of West Africa to the highland plateaus of the East, from the Nile's headwaters to the diamond fields of the South. The instruments of partition are not armies alone, but chartered companies granted quasi-sovereign authority. The Royal Niger Company, under George Taubman Goldie, extends British claims along the Niger and Benue rivers, signing treaties with local rulers who often cannot read the documents they mark. In 1886, the company receives its royal charter. By 1897, it fields its own constabulary, wages war against the Nupe and Ilorin Emirates, and administers territory that will become Nigeria. In East Africa, the Imperial British East Africa Company pushes inland from Mombasa toward the Great Lakes. In the south, Cecil Rhodes's British South Africa Company receives its charter in 1889, its explicit purpose the exploitation of mineral wealth and the extension of British territory northward from the Cape. Rhodes dreams of a continuous corridor of British red from Cape Town to Cairo. His company's pioneers crossed the Limpopo in 1890, establishing Fort Salisbury in Mashonaland. The Ndebele Kingdom under King Lobengula resists. In 1893, company forces equipped with Maxim guns destroy Ndebele Impis at the Shangani River and the Bembesi. Lobengula flees and dies in early 1894. 3 years later, both Ndebele and the Shona rise in the Chimurenga of 1896 to 1897, a coordinated resistance crushed only after months of brutal campaigning. Farther north, the Mahdist state in Sudan presents a different challenge. Since 1885, when the Mahdi's forces killed General Gordon at Khartoum, Sudan has remained beyond British reach. In 1896, Horatio Herbert Kitchener begins a methodical reconquest, advancing up the Nile with railway and gunboat. On the 2nd of September, 1898, at Omdurman, his force of 25,000 faces nearly 50,000 Mahdist warriors. The battle lasts 5 hours. British Maxim guns and artillery kill approximately 10,000 Sudanese. British losses number 47 dead. The disproportion reveals the technological abyss separating industrial and pre-industrial warfare. Weeks later, Kitchener's forces encounter a small French expedition at Fashoda, 500 miles upriver. For weeks, the two European powers stand at the brink of war over a swampy outpost neither truly occupies. France withdraws in November, conceding the Upper Nile to Britain. In West Africa, the Ashanti resist repeatedly. The final expedition of 1900 sees British forces march on Kumasi, exile King Prempeh, and annex the Ashanti kingdom outright. Resistance is met with village burnings and collective punishment. Then comes South Africa, and the war that shakes the empire's conscience. Tensions between Britain and the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, sharpened by the discovery of gold on the Witwatersrand in 1886, erupt into open conflict in October 1899. Britain expects swift victory. Instead, Boer commandos, mobile, expert marksmen fighting on familiar terrain, inflict humiliating defeats at Stormberg, Magersfontein, and Colenso in a single black week of December 1899. Britain pours nearly 450,000 troops into the conflict. Under Kitchener and Roberts, conventional warfare gives way to scorched earth tactics. Farmsteads burned, livestock slaughtered, crops destroyed. Boer women and children are herded into concentration camps where overcrowding, disease, and malnutrition kill an estimated 28,000, most of them children. Black Africans confined in separate camps suffer similarly, at least 20,000 dead. The war ends with the Treaty of Vereeniging in May 1902. Britain wins sovereignty over the republics, but at staggering cost. 22,000 British soldiers dead, over £200 million spent. At home, the Liberal opposition, investigative journalists, and Emily Hobhouse's reports on the camps ignite a moral reckoning. The empire has won, yet something in its self-image has cracked. The certainty that British power carries civilization forward now meets the evidence of what that power inflicts upon the defenseless. The empire that emerges from the Boer War's moral shadow is not a single entity, but a constellation of territories governed by radically different systems, connected by shipping lanes, submarine telegraph cables, and a shared allegiance to the crown. By the first decade of the 20th century, this patchwork stretches across every climate zone on Earth, and the daily experience of living within it varies so profoundly from one territory to another that a wheat farmer in Saskatchewan and a rubber tapper in Malaya inhabit what are effectively different civilizations bound by the same flag. The self-governing dominions represent the empire's most privileged tier. Canada, federated since 1867, controls its own tariffs, immigration policy, and internal legislation. The Commonwealth of Australia, proclaimed on the 1st of January 1901, unites 6 colonies under a federal constitution modelled partly on Westminster and partly on Washington. New Zealand, granted Dominion status in 1907, pioneers social legislation, old age pensions, women's suffrage achieved in 1893, that the mother country has yet to match. These are white settler societies whose self-governance rests on the systematic dispossession of indigenous peoples. In Australia, Aboriginal populations are excluded from the census, confined to reserves, and subjected to policies of child removal. In New Zealand, Maori land passes steadily into settler hands through the Native Land Court. The dominions govern themselves, but they govern on stolen ground. Below the dominions lie the Crown colonies, territories administered directly from London through appointed governors. In Jamaica, Trinidad, Ceylon, the Straits Settlements, and dozens of other possessions, legislative councils exist but are dominated by officials rather than elected representatives. The Calabar operates with varying degrees of formality. In the Straits settlements, European clubs exclude Asian members. In Kenya's highlands, fertile land is reserved for white settlers, while Kikuyu communities are pushed onto inadequate reserves. India occupies a category of its own. The Raj governs 300 million people through a civil service of barely 1,000 British officers, supported by a far larger Indian subordinate service. District collectors administer territories the size of English counties, dispensing justice, collecting revenue, and maintaining order. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, initially petitions for greater representation within the system rather than independence from it. Hill stations like Simla replicate English social life at 7,000 feet, the Viceroy's summer capital, complete with amateur theatricals and afternoon tea, while below in the plains, famine periodically kills millions. The extraction of labor fuels the system. After emancipation ended slavery, indentured servitude replaced it. Between 1834 and 1917, over 1.5 million Indians are transported under contract to sugar plantations in Fiji, Natal, Trinidad, Mauritius, and British Guiana. Conditions on the estates, 5-year contracts, penal sanctions for absence, wages barely above subsistence, earn the system the name "a new system of slavery" from its critics. In Malaya, Tamil workers tap rubber on vast estates, while Chinese laborers work tin mines. In East Africa, Indian laborers build the Uganda Railway, the so-called Lunatic Express, at the cost of over 2,500 lives. Mission schools spread English literacy alongside Christianity, creating educated colonial elites who will eventually articulate the demand for self-rule in the colonizer's own language. Colonial courthouses impose English common law or adapted legal codes, criminalizing local customs while establishing property rights that favor European capital. Railways carry raw materials to ports, Indian cotton to Lancashire, Malayan tin to Liverpool, South African gold to the Bank of England, while manufactured goods flow back along the same tracks. The empire at the turn of the century is a machine of astonishing complexity, held together not by consent, but by habit, force, economic dependency, and the sheer administrative confidence of a ruling class that has never known anything else. It functions, it extracts, it educates selectively, and in the process, it creates the very classes, lawyers, journalists, teachers, clerks, who will one day dismantle it from within. The summer of 1914 arrives with the mechanical certainty of a railway timetable. On the 4th of August, Britain declares war on Germany, and within hours the declaration ripples outward along telegraph cables to every corner of an empire spanning a quarter of the globe. The war that begins in the fields of Belgium will be fought on the beaches of Turkey, the deserts of Mesopotamia, the bush of East Africa, and the frozen mud of northern France. And it will be fought not by the British Isles alone, but by the full weight of an imperial system now called upon to justify its existence in blood. Indian cavalry regiments receive mobilization orders before the month ends. The Indian Expeditionary Force, over 130,000 men in its first contingent, sails from Bombay and Karachi, arriving at Marseilles in late September. Sikh lancers, Gurkha riflemen, Rajput infantry, and Muslim gunners from the Punjab disembark onto French quaysides, their turbans and khaki tunics a visual declaration that this is no European war. By October they hold trenches near Ypres, enduring gas, shell fire, and a Flemish winter for which nothing in their training has prepared them. At Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, Indian divisions spearhead an assault that briefly breaks the German line, the first significant Allied offensive on the Western Front, at a cost of over 4,000 Indian casualties in 3 days. Canada sends its first division by autumn of 1914. The Australian Imperial Force and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force begin training in Egypt. The Caribbean contributes the British West Indies Regiment. From West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, African soldiers and carriers are recruited, often coerced, into service. The King's African Rifles expands from its peacetime strength into a force of tens of thousands. In German East Africa, a campaign begins in 1914 that will grind on for 4 years through malarial bush, killing far more porters and carriers than combatants. An estimated 100,000 African carriers die of disease and exhaustion in that theater alone. Gallipoli crystallizes the Imperial War's tragedy. In April 1915, Allied forces land on the Turkish peninsula to force the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire from the war. Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, storm ashore at a cove beneath sheer cliffs, pinned down from the first hour. For 8 months they hold a beachhead measured in yards, suffering dysentery, thirst, and relentless Turkish fire. Indian troops fight at Cape Helles. The campaign fails utterly. Over 44,000 Allied dead remain on the peninsula when evacuation comes in January 1916. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli becomes a founding national myth, sacrifice offered in Britain's name for objectives chosen in London. On the Western Front, the Empire bleeds through 1916 and 17. The Somme, Passchendaele, Vimy Ridge, Canadian troops take the ridge in April 1917 in an action that forges Canadian national identity. South African brigades are destroyed at Delville Wood. Indian Labour Corps dig trenches and build roads behind the lines. The war consumes men at industrial scale. Britain alone suffers nearly 900,000 military dead. The dominions and colonies hundreds of thousands more. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, British and Indian forces advance up the Tigris toward Baghdad, suffering catastrophic defeat at Kut in April 1916. Over 13,000 troops surrender, enduring brutal Ottoman captivity. Baghdad falls only in March 1917. In Palestine, General Allenby's forces, including Indian cavalry and the Australian light horse, take Jerusalem in December 1917. Behind the military campaigns, diplomats carve the post-war map. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 secretly divides Ottoman Arab lands between Britain and France. The Balfour Declaration of November 1917 promises a Jewish national home in Palestine, a commitment made without consulting the Arab population already living there. By November 1918, when the armistice silences the guns, the empire has reached its greatest territorial extent. League of Nations mandates hand Britain control over Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan. But the cost is staggering. The national debt has multiplied 14-fold. A generation of young men lies buried from Flanders to Gallipoli to Mesopotamia. And in the colonies, those who fought expect recognition. What they receive instead is repression, nowhere more brutally than at Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar on the 13th of April 1919, where General Dyer orders troops to fire on an unarmed crowd, killing at least 379. The empire has won its war. It has also planted the seeds of its own dissolution. The seeds germinate with terrifying speed. Within months of the Amritsar massacre, the political landscape of British India transforms. Mohandas Gandhi, already known for his campaigns in South Africa and his wartime loyalty to the Crown, now turns that moral authority against the empire itself. In August 1920, he launches the non-cooperation movement, calling on Indians to boycott British courts, schools, titles, and imported cloth. Millions respond. Bonfires of Lancashire textiles blaze in town squares from Lahore to Madras. Students abandon government colleges. Lawyers forsake lucrative practices. The spinning wheel becomes a revolutionary symbol. Each thread of homespun khadi, a quiet act of economic warfare against Manchester's mills. Simultaneously, 3,000 miles to the west, Ireland bleeds. The Easter Rising of 1916 had been crushed, but the executions that followed created martyrs. By 1919, Sinn Féin's elected representatives refused to sit at Westminster, constituting instead their own parliament, the Dáil Éireann, in Dublin. The Irish Republican Army wages guerrilla war against the Royal Irish Constabulary and the hated Black and Tans, ex-soldiers recruited to suppress rebellion with methods that shock even British public opinion. Ambushes on country roads, reprisal burnings of creameries and town centres, assassinations and intelligence warfare define the conflict. By July 1921, exhaustion on both sides produces a truce. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 partitions the island, creating the Irish Free State in the south, while 6 northern counties remain within the United Kingdom. The oldest colony has torn itself partially free, and the precedent reverberates through every territory watching from afar. In Egypt, mass demonstrations in 1919 force Britain to grant nominal independence in 1922, though British troops remain garrisoned along the Suez Canal, and British advisers retain effective control over defense and foreign policy. In Iraq, a violent revolt in 1920 costs Britain more casualties than the entire Mesopotamian campaign of the war, compelling the creation of a client monarchy under Faisal, independence in form, subordination in substance. The pattern repeats, formal sovereignty conceded while strategic and economic levers remain firmly in British hands. Back in India, Gandhi suspends non-cooperation in February 1922 after a mob at Chauri Chaura burns alive 22 policemen. The movement's sudden halt frustrates radicals, but preserves its moral discipline. The 1920s pass in constitutional negotiations. The Simon Commission of 1928, boycotted because it contains no Indian members, provokes nationwide protests. Then, on the 12th of March 1930, Gandhi begins the Salt March. Walking 240 miles from his ashram at Sabarmati to the coastal village of Dandi, he reaches the sea on the 6th of April and lifts a handful of natural salt from the mud, breaking the government's salt monopoly in an act of civil disobedience so simple and so profound that it galvanizes the entire subcontinent. 60,000 Indians are arrested in the months that follow. The Round Table Conferences in London between 1930 and 1932 attempt to negotiate India's constitutional future, but founder on questions of communal representation and the princely states. The Government of India Act of 1935, the longest piece of legislation Parliament has ever passed, creates provincial autonomy and a federal framework, yet reserves defence, foreign affairs, and emergency powers for the Viceroy. It satisfies no one fully. Meanwhile, the Great Depression ravages the imperial economy. Commodity prices collapse, rubber, tin, cocoa, wheat, wool, devastating colonial producers from Malaya to the Gold Coast. At the Ottawa Conference of 1932, Britain and the Dominions erect a system of imperial preference tariffs, abandoning the free trade doctrine that had defined British commercial policy for nearly a century. The Statute of Westminster, passed in 1931, formally recognizes the legislative independence of the Dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Irish Free State, acknowledging a reality that has existed in practice for years. In Palestine, the contradictions of the Balfour Declaration explode. Arab resentment of Jewish immigration, accelerated by refugees fleeing European persecution, erupts into full revolt between 1936 and 1939. British troops suppress the uprising with collective punishments, house demolitions, and detention camps. By 1939, the empire stretches across the map in its familiar pink, but beneath the cartographic confidence, every seam strains. Nationalism has become the dominant political force from Dublin to Delhi to Cairo to Jerusalem. The illusion of permanent control persists only on paper, and paper, as the next decade will prove, burns easily. The paper burns on the 1st of September, 1939. German armor crosses into Poland, and 2 days later Britain declares war, not as a single nation, but as an empire. The Dominions follow within the week. Australia and New Zealand on the 3rd, South Africa on the 6th, Canada on the 10th. India receives no consultation. The Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, simply announces that India is at war, committing 350 million people to a conflict they had no voice in choosing. The constitutional outrage galvanizes the Indian National Congress, whose provincial ministers resign en masse. The empire enters its greatest trial already fractured at its core. For the first year, the war remains distant from most colonial territories, but the Blitz transforms London into a city of rubble and fire. Between September 1940 and May 1941, German bombers kill over 40,000 civilians. The docks of the East End, the warehouses that once stored imperial tea and sugar, burn through the night. Britain stands alone after the fall of France, its survival dependent on Atlantic convoys bringing American material under the Lend-Lease Act, signed in March 1941. The financial terms are devastating. Britain liquidates overseas assets, sells investments accumulated over a century, and accumulates debt that will take generations to repay. The arsenal of democracy comes at the price of imperial solvency. In August 1941, Churchill meets Roosevelt aboard warships off Newfoundland. The Atlantic Charter they produce proclaims the right of all peoples to choose their own form of government. Churchill later insists this applies only to nations under Nazi occupation, not to the British Empire. But the words are on paper, broadcast worldwide, and colonial nationalists from Accra to Calcutta take note. Then Singapore falls. On the 15th of February 1942, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival surrenders approximately 80,000 troops to a Japanese force half that size. It is the largest capitulation in British military history. The fortress that was supposed to guarantee imperial dominance in Asia proves to have guns pointing seaward while the enemy advances through the jungle from the north. Across Southeast Asia, Malaya, Burma, Hong Kong, the speed of Japanese conquest demolishes the myth that European power is invincible. Asian populations watch white soldiers marched into captivity. The psychological damage to imperial prestige is irreversible. In India, the fall of Singapore and the Japanese advance into Burma bring the war to the subcontinent's doorstep. Gandhi launches the Quit India movement in August 1942, demanding immediate British withdrawal. The response is swift and brutal. Over 100,000 arrests, mass detentions, aerial strafing of protesters in some districts. Congress leadership spends the remainder of the war in prison. Meanwhile, Subhas Chandra Bose raises the Indian National Army from prisoners of war, fighting alongside Japan against British forces in Burma. Yet India simultaneously provides the largest volunteer army in history. By 1945, 2.5 million Indians serve under British command. In North Africa against Rommel, in Italy, in Burma's brutal jungle campaigns. African colonies contribute hundreds of thousands more. West African divisions fight in Burma. East African troops serve in Madagascar and the Middle East. Caribbean volunteers join the Royal Air Force. The empire's survival depends on the blood of its subjects. The Bengal famine of 1943 reveals the empire's moral bankruptcy with terrible clarity. A combination of wartime disruption, Japanese occupation of Burma cutting rice imports, hoarding, inflation, and administrative indifference produces catastrophe. An estimated 3 million Bengalis starve to death, while grain continues to be exported and military stockpiles remain untouched. Churchill's war cabinet declines to divert shipping for relief. The famine receives minimal coverage in the British press. In the villages of Bengal, bodies line roadsides and mothers abandon children they cannot feed. Victory, when it comes in May and August 1945, finds Britain exhausted. The national debt stands at over 3 times gross domestic product. The empire's eastern territories have been liberated not primarily by British arms, but by American and Commonwealth forces. In July 1945, the British electorate delivers its verdict. Churchill is swept from power in a Labour landslide. Clement Attlee's government inherits a bankrupt state, a restive empire, and the unmistakable reality that the age of imperial dominion is over. The war has been won. The empire has not survived it. Attlee's government moves with a speed that shocks the old imperial establishment. Within 18 months of taking office, the new Prime Minister accepts what decades of nationalist agitation have made undeniable: India cannot be held. The subcontinent that once generated the revenues sustaining British global power now drains a treasury already emptied by war. In February 1947, Attlee announces that Britain will transfer power no later than June 1948. The Viceroy, Lord Wavell, is replaced by Lord Louis Mountbatten, a man of royal blood and supreme confidence, dispatched to oversee the dissolution of the Raj. Mountbatten arrives in Delhi in March 1947 and immediately accelerates the timetable. The Muslim League under Muhammad Ali Jinnah demands a separate state. The Indian National Congress under Jawaharlal Nehru insists on unity but cannot prevent the fracture. Within weeks, Mountbatten concludes that partition is inevitable and advances the date of independence to August. A British barrister named Cyril Radcliffe, who has never visited India, is given 5 weeks to draw the borders that will divide Punjab and Bengal, splitting villages, irrigation systems, families, and faiths along lines inked on inadequate maps. The Indian Independence Act receives royal assent on the 18th of July, 1947. At midnight on the 14th of August, Pakistan comes into existence. Hours later, as the clock strikes 12 on the 15th, India is born. In Delhi's Constituent Assembly, Nehru speaks of a tryst with destiny. The Union Jack descends over the Red Fort for the last time, but the borders Radcliffe has drawn ignite a catastrophe. Across Punjab, Sikhs, Hindus, and Muslims, who have lived as neighbours for generations, turn upon one another. Trains arrive at stations on both sides of the new frontier, carrying only corpses. Columns of refugees stretch for 50 miles, an estimated 14 million people displaced, perhaps 2 million killed in communal violence that neither the new governments nor the departing British can control. The greatest mass migration in recorded history unfolds in weeks. 6 months later, Britain abandons another mandate. In Palestine, 3 decades of contradictory promises, to Arabs and Jews alike, have produced irreconcilable conflict. The United Nations votes in November 1947 to partition the territory. Britain, unwilling to enforce a plan rejected by the Arab population, simply withdraws. On the 14th of May 1948, the last British High Commissioner departs Haifa by sea. The State of Israel is proclaimed hours later. 5 Arab armies invade the following day. 700,000 Palestinians flee or are expelled from their homes. The borders Britain failed to settle remain unsettled still. In Malaya, a different crisis demands a different response. Communist insurgents, many of them ethnic Chinese veterans of anti-Japanese resistance, launch an armed rebellion in June 1948. Britain declares an emergency and commits troops, but also pursues a counter-insurgency strategy combining resettlement of rural populations, intelligence operations, and political concessions, promising independence once the insurgency is defeated. The campaign will last 12 years. Meanwhile, the empire's economic logic collapses. The Suez Canal, that artery of imperial communication, becomes the site of Britain's definitive humiliation. In July 1956, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the canal. Britain and France, in secret collusion with Israel, launch a military intervention in October. The operation succeeds tactically, but fails utterly in its strategic aim. The United States, furious at not being consulted, threatens to collapse the pound sterling. Within days, Prime Minister Anthony Eden orders a ceasefire and withdrawal. The message is unmistakable. Britain can no longer act as a great power without American consent. The following year, the Gold Coast becomes Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve independence. Kwame Nkrumah stands before jubilant crowds in Accra on the 6th of March 1957, declaring that the independence of Ghana is meaningless unless linked to the total liberation of Africa. In February 1960, Prime Minister Harold Macmillan addresses the South African Parliament in Cape Town and acknowledges what the decade has proven. A wind of change is blowing through the continent. He declares, "The age of European empire in Africa is ending. The statement is not prophecy, it is recognition of accomplished fact. The speed of dissolution surpasses anything the Colonial Office has anticipated. In the single year of 1960, 17 African nations achieve independence. The year itself becomes known as the Year of Africa. Nigeria, the most populous territory on the continent, lowers the Union Jack on the 1st of October 1960, and a green and white flag rises over Lagos. Sierra Leone follows in 1961, Tanganyika in December of the same year, Uganda in 1962. Each ceremony follows a now familiar choreography: the midnight countdown, the descending colonial flag, the ascending national standard, the roar of crowds who have waited generations for this moment. But behind the pageantry lies a darker history that the ceremonies cannot erase. In Kenya, the British response to the Mau Mau uprising has produced a system of detention camps holding over 100,000 Kikuyu men and women. Forced labor, systematic beatings, and torture are documented by colonial officials themselves. At Hola Camp in March 1959, 11 detainees are beaten to death by guards, an event that reaches Parliament and accelerates the decision to withdraw. Jomo Kenyatta, imprisoned for nearly a decade on charges of managing the uprising, walks free in 1961 and leads Kenya to independence on the 12th of December 1963. The transfer of power is orderly on the surface. Beneath it, the scars of detention and dispossession remain unhealed. The Central African Federation, that artificial union of Southern Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia, and Nyasaland, imposed in 1953, collapses under African nationalist pressure. Nyasaland becomes Malawi in 1964. Northern Rhodesia becomes Zambia the same year. But Southern Rhodesia's white settler minority, numbering roughly 250,000 against 4 million Africans, refuses to accept majority rule. On the 11th of November 1965, Prime Minister Ian Smith issues a unilateral declaration of independence, the first such rebellion against the Crown since the American colonies in 1776. Britain imposes sanctions but refuses military intervention. A bush war grinds on for 15 years until the Lancaster House Agreement of 1979 finally produces the independent state of Zimbabwe. In Aden, the withdrawal is neither orderly nor celebratory. British forces fight a bitter counterinsurgency against nationalist guerrillas through the mid-1960s. On the 30th of November 1967, the last British soldiers board helicopters from Kormaksa airfield under sniper fire. The colony becomes the People's Republic of South Yemen. It is the most humiliating military departure since Suez. In January 1968, Prime Minister Harold Wilson announces the withdrawal of British military forces from east of Suez, from the Persian Gulf, from Singapore, from Malaysia. The decision is driven by economic necessity. Sterling has been devalued. The Treasury cannot sustain global military commitments. By 1971, the great naval base at Singapore passes fully to local control. Britain's military frontier contracts to the North Atlantic and the European continent. The Caribbean follows its own rhythm. Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago achieve independence in 1962. Barbados in 1966. Smaller islands follow through the 1970s. The Bahamas, Grenada, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent. Each retains the Crown as nominal head of state, the Privy Council as final court of appeal, and cricket as national passion, institutional inheritances that outlast the political bond. Hong Kong remains the great anomaly. Leased from China in 1898 for 99 years, its return is a matter of contractual obligation rather than nationalist revolt. The territory thrives as a capitalist enclave, its future deferred but inevitable. By 1980, the formal empire has shrunk to a scattering of small islands and Gibraltar. Then in April 1982, Argentina invades the Falkland Islands, a windswept archipelago of 1,800 British subjects in the South Atlantic. Margaret Thatcher dispatches a naval task force 8,000 miles to reclaim them. The war lasts 74 days, costs 255 British lives, and ends in Argentine surrender. It is the last imperial war, fought not for territory or trade, but for the principle that a remnant population's wishes cannot be overridden by force. The empire that once governed a quarter of the earth now defends specks of rock at the world's edge. The specks of rock remain, but the shadow stretches across continents. In 1981, the British Nationality Act redraws the boundaries of belonging, stripping automatic right of abode from citizens of former colonies, codifying in law a distinction between the island and its former possessions that geography had always implied, but politics had long obscured. The act arrives as the Windrush generation, those Caribbean migrants who rebuilt post-war Britain from 1948 onward, discovers that decades of residence, labor, and taxation guarantee nothing without paperwork. Their children and grandchildren will face deportation threats well into the 21st century, a scandal that erupts in 2018 when the Home Office destroys landing cards and demands documentation that was never issued. The borders drawn in imperial offices continue to bleed. In Kashmir, the line of control established in 1948 remains the most militarized frontier on Earth. India and Pakistan have fought 4 conflicts over territory that Mountbatten's hasty partition left unresolved. In Palestine, the mandate's contradictory promises to Arab and Jewish populations have produced 7 decades of occupation, intifada, and failed peace processes. Across Africa, straight-line borders slicing through ethnic and linguistic communities generate civil wars in Nigeria, Sudan, Rwanda, and the Congo. The Sykes-Picot architecture of Iraq fractures along sectarian lines that British mandatory rule entrenched rather than healed. A reality made visceral when British forces returned to Basra in 2003, patrolling streets their grandfathers once governed. At midnight on the 30th of June, 1997, the Union Jack descends over Government House in Hong Kong. Prince Charles and Governor Chris Patten watch as the territory passes to the People's Republic of China under the terms of the 1984 Joint Declaration. Rain falls on the ceremony. The last significant colonial possession returns to its sovereign, 156 years after the Treaty of Nanking ceded it. The handover is orderly, televised, and final. The Commonwealth of Nations persists. 56 member states by the 2020s, encompassing 2.4 billion people. It holds summits, organizes games, and promotes trade, yet possesses no binding authority. Several Caribbean nations begin formal processes toward republicanism. When Elizabeth II dies in September 2022, after 70 years on the throne, the question of whether the crown retains meaning beyond Britain's shores becomes immediate. Barbados has already become a republic in 2021. Jamaica, Australia, and others debate following. In Bristol, in June 2020, protesters topple the bronze statue of Edward Colston, slave trader, philanthropist, civic benefactor, and roll it into the harbour. In Oxford, students demand the removal of Cecil Rhodes from Oriel College's facade. Museums across Britain face calls to return looted artefacts, the Benin bronzes, the Elgin marbles, the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The debate is not merely about objects, but about narrative, whose story the national past tells and whose suffering it acknowledges. Brexit, enacted in 2020, carries unmistakable post-imperial resonance. The language of sovereignty reclaimed, of global Britain unshackled from European constraint, echoes older fantasies of maritime independence. Yet the trade deals sought with former colonies prove modest, and the Commonwealth cannot substitute for a continental market of 450 million. Modern London itself is the Empire's most visible legacy, a city where over 300 languages are spoken, where curry houses outnumber fish and chip shops, where the National Health Service depends on doctors and nurses recruited from former colonies. The English language, common law, parliamentary procedure, and the Westminster model of government operate across dozens of nations. Railways built for extraction now carry commuters in India, Kenya, and Malaysia. The empire is gone. Its consequences are not. They live in borders, languages, legal codes, economic disparities, family histories, and the contested memory of what was done, what was endured, and what remains unresolved. The island at the edge of the world shaped the modern globe, and the modern globe, in turn, has reshaped the island beyond recognition. Thank you for watching this journey through the rise and fall of the largest empire in history. If this story moved or informed you, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new documentary.